We started with an analysis of the various psukim that the Rambam invokes at the beginning of Hilchos Talmud Torah to establish the obligation, number one, on the father to teach his son Torah, ViLemadetem osam es bnechem. Number two, on the father to teach his grandson Torah, v'odatel lemchem bnei bneihem. And finally, the chiyuv on every chacham to teach all the talmidim derives from ViShinantem v'nechem mipi hashmua talmidecha elu banecha elu talmidecha. So we have these three psukim and three obligations in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. That's the opening two halachos in the Rambam. I'd like to introduce another important tool in Lumdis, specifically in learning the Rambam, and that's the Kesef Mishnah, the same author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Cairo, who lived, as you can tell by his name, in Egypt. Then he settled in Tzfat, and he authored the Shulchan Aruch, he authored the Kesef Mishnah on the Rambam, and on the tour, the Beis Yosef. So he was a very prolific writer of Machadesh, and very often he's interested in giving you the background to the Rambam. Where did the Rambam get it from? He'll quote a Gemara, very important tool. But in this case, I want to learn with you a piece in the Kesef Mishnah here at the beginning of Hilchos Talmud Torah, because I think it touches on the discussion that we've had about the relationship between ViLemadetem and ViShinantem. So if you have access to the Kesef Mishnah, it's actually the second paragraph in the Kesef Mishnah, and the Dibra Maschil is Kishem Shechayv Adam Lelamed Es Bino. So that triggers off a desire on the part of the Kesef Mishnah to quote a Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Lamed, which serves as the background, the source for the Rambam, who obligates the grandfather to teach his grandson. And the Rambam goes on to, in the name of the Sifri, according to the Kesef Mishnah, to tell us that there's an additional chiyuv incumbent upon every chacham derived from the pasuk ViShinantem levanecha. Then you see a Dibra Maschil, it's on the left side of your page, called Imkein Lomenitz Tava. Kavanas Rabbeinu, the intention of the Rambam, Losses to offer Shnei Hevdelim, two differences, bein Beno leben Chavero, between his own son and his friend's son. So it's very interesting that the Kesef Mishnah doesn't mention the word question, she'ela or kushya, when he's describing the Rambam. It might not necessarily be that the Rambam was asking a kasha. The Lomenitz Tava was really offering an answer to a question, and we have to figure out what the implicit question was. And the Kesef Mishnah writes that there are two differences between the obligation of the father vis-a-vis his son and the obligation of a chacham vis-a-vis ben chavero, somebody else's son. Echad, dibino kodem. And sheni, dibino chayv liska lo malamed, im huenu yochol, aval ben chavero, eno chayev lahaskir lo malamed. Tedafka b'tor gufo nischayev, aval lo b'hotzos mamono. So this second Hevdel brought down by the Kesef Mishnah is the subject of the Rambam in Halacha Gimel, Chayev Liskar Malami Libno, but the Kesef Mishnah puts it into very lumdisha terms, the terminology here, and he differentiates between a chiyuv mamon, which he calls hotzas mamon, spending money, and then by contrast, torach gufo, the physical action. And herein, according to Kesef Mishnah, lies the fundamental difference between the father vis-a-vis his son in terms of the chiyuv of Talmud Torah, which is a chiyuv Talmud Torah that goes beyond just torach gufo. But if he himself can't teach his son Torah, then he will hire a Melamed pay a salary to teach his son. In contrast, the Chiyuv al Kol Chacham V'Chacham Yisrael is not a Chiyuv Mamon, it's only Torah Chaguf, meaning if you're a Chacham, you're capable of teaching Torah, then that's what you have to do. As far as the Ben Chavero, he has to be taught Torah. But nowhere do we find that the Chacham, if let's say he cannot teach Torah, he's got to hire someone to teach Torah to Ben Chavero, only in the case of a father. Okay. Now let's read the next piece in the Kesef Mishnah very carefully. The Efshar. Now, whenever you see the word Efshar, you understand that there's a Chakira here. There are two sides to the coin. Efshar is Mitzaded, maybe it's this side, and we have to figure out what the other side is. Efshar de Ladas Rabbeinu, it's possible, according to the Rambam, Gam leben beno chayv lahaskil lo malamed, that maybe the chiyuv to teach your grandson is a monetary chiyuv as well. Imagine a grandfather has to pay for the education of his grandson. So at this point, conceptually, the Kesef Mishnah is already touching on the possibility that Ben Beno, his grandson, is not exactly identical to Beno. And there may be two fundamentally different obligations. And then after Kamino, the difference would be whether he has to hire a Malamed. In the case of Beno, the father can't teach him himself, he's got to hire a Malamed. In the case of Ben Beno, maybe yes, maybe no. Now the Kesef Mishnah, which I would say part 3, paragraph 3, introduces another Chakira. Ben Beno. What about his great-grandson? And the Kesef Mishnah writes, Nira li. And whenever you see those two words, Nira li, wherever you see them, it means that there's an issue here and you could argue it, but this is the way I would approach it. Whoever says Nira li. Pashut. Now it's a little strange. He says Pashut, meaning after thinking about it this way and that way, could it be X, could it be Y? I came to the conclusion it's definitely X or definitely Y. Pashut de kodem leben chavero. So he has a choice between teaching his great-grandson, he calls it Ben Beno, or teaching Yenam's somebody else's son. Certainly he should teach his great-grandson, Ben Beno. That takes preference. But then the question is, so why did the Rambam only mention Ben Beno? V'nokat Ben Beno. Why did the Rambam say Ben Beno? To hu adin leben Ben Beno. What really the Rambam is trying to convey is that for all generations henceforth, that's the din of Kedima. V'lo havi le'lemichtav vodatem lezaracha. You might ask the following question, says the Kesef Mishnah. Why didn't the Torah say ViShinantem lezaracha, which would mean all your zera for all the generations? You see the difference between bincha and zaracha, right? Bincha means your son, but zaracha means all the generations beyond, including your great-grandson, etc. And says the Kesef Mishnah as an answer, he has a technical answer, that the Torah couldn't say zaracha. Why not? To have a mina benos bichlal. We would have come to a mistaken conclusion that Zaracha means your generations includes your daughters as well. And that's not so, because B'neichem v'lo b'nosechem. And now we get to paragraph number 4. So again, just a quick review of the 3 paragraphs that we had until we get to the meat of the matter, which is paragraph number 4. Paragraph number 1, 2 differences between Beno and Ben Chavero. 1, Chayv L'Haskir in the case of Beno, and 2, Chayv L'Hakdim. Paragraph number 2, and here the Kesef Mishnah seems to vacillate. He's not 100% sure, but possibly he says that the grandfather, Aviv, has to pay a Malamed if he's not teaching his grandson personally. So that whereas Ben Chavero, as we said, doesn't require you to spend any money. If you're a Chacham and you can teach Ben Chavero, go ahead. You're obligated to do so. But if it would entail hiring someone, because you yourself can't teach Ben Chavero, you don't have to pay out of pocket for that. But in the case of Ben Bino, Efshar, the Gamle Ben Bino Chayv Haskil Malamed. He's got to hire a Malamed, pay out of pocket for his grandson. Paragraph number 3, Ben Bino. And here, on the one hand, Nira Lee seems to imply that maybe you could argue with me, but on the end he says it's Pashut, that Ben Bino comes under the din of Kedima. He doesn't mention anything about paying salaries. And then he asks himself a question. If Ben Bino, his great-grandson, Pashut, the Kodem LeBen Chaver, he comes before someone else's son, and the Rambam, when he said Ben Bino, he didn't mean just Ben Bino, his grandson. He meant Huadin LeBen Ben Bino. But now he asks the question not on the Rambam, but on the Pasuk itself. The Pasuk says, ViShinantem Levanecha. Why didn't it just say Zarecha? Which would include all the generations. And he comes up with a technical answer to that question, and that is Lo havi le lemichtav v'odato l'zaracha dav mina banos bichlal. The word zaracha would have been misleading. We could have come to the conclusion that a father, grandfather, great-grandfather, etc., has to teach Torah to his son and his daughter and his grandchildren, because why would the daughter be included? Because she's also zaracha. So the Kesevish is pointing out on a biblical level, in terms of how to understand two words, there's a fundamental difference between banecha and zarecha. Banecha means v'lo b'nosecha, and zarecha would include even b'nosecha. So therefore, there's a technical reason why the Torah didn't say zarecha, but basically we could rewrite the pasuk, and it could say v'hodatem le-zarecha, and that would include even great-grandchildren. Ben Bino. And now we get to the meat of the matter, paragraph number 4. Aval ha-misafkali. The following is a suffix in my mind. In other words, the Kesef Mishnah is admitting that he has a very ambiguous situation here. He doesn't know which way to turn. I ben Bito, Kodem LeBen Chaver. Now we're going to talk about Ben Bito, his grandson through his daughter. In other words, this young man is the son of, he's the ben of Bito Shel Hasaba. Okay. Efshar, maybe. Di'eno Kodem LeBen Chaver. Now, I don't know if we can deduce from the word efshar here in the Kesef Mishnah that this is the way he really wants to go, but in any event, he himself says it's misafkali. So obviously he's in the dark here. And whether Ben Bito is Kodem LeBen Chavero, he says, you know what? I have a possibility that he's not. He's not on the radar screen. Di efshar di ein Kodem LeBen Chavero, in the case of a bas, you can't say that he, the grandfather, was chayiv to teach the bas and then pass it down to the ben habas, because a father doesn't have to teach his bas. It seems that the Kesef Mishnah, and I want you to think about this, is vacillating about whether we need a continuous chiyuv, unbroken chain that goes from the father to his son, from his son to grandson, etc., or no. All we need is the descendant. And then we get back to the original point that we saw before in paragraph number 3 of the Kesef Mishnah, namely that the Torah should have said Zarecha, but for technical reasons we would be misled by the word Zarecha, but really in effect it does say Zarecha. Now, I want you to study this Kesef Mishnah very carefully, review it, not just because, which in and of itself would justify my point, that the Kesef Mishnah is a tool that you really have to get used to using. And we see the brilliance of the Kesef Mishnah here in 4 different paragraphs. Each one has a chidush. Kesef Mishnah is not to be taken lightly as just spitting forth sources for the Rambam. There are many Sfarim that have been written on the Rambam that simply see as they go, where did the Rambam get this from? Which in and of itself is a valid and very important study, but that's not the Kesef Mishnah. Look how he's analyzing this. A suffix here and a suffix there. He's not sure of this. 2 differences between Bino and Ben Chavero. A question about Ben Bino. A question about whether or not Ben Bino requires Hotzas Mamon or it's only a Torah Guf. And all this is in this, action-packed Kesef Mishnah. It's packed in there. Very important. I'd like to focus on the 4th paragraph about Ben Bito. I find it a little bit odd at first glance that Misafkali, the suffix presented here by the Kesef Mishnah, is I ben Bito kodem le ben Chavero. So you have 2 boys in front of you. You have to decide which one to teach. One is your grandson through your daughter. The other is Yenam's son. Who comes first? Only a din of Kedima. But I would like to ask a more fundamental question and raise a more fundamental suffix, which is completely omitted and skipped by the Kesef Mishnah. How do we understand ViLemadetem levanecha levnei vanecha? This is the source for the chiyuv incumbent upon the grandfather to teach his grandson Torah. Who is the grandson? Could it be not, as the pasuk says explicitly, livnei vanecha, the son of your son? Could it also be the son of your daughter, bnei bitecha? That doesn't appear in the Kesef Mishnah. He sort of like skips a step over here. Before you get into the question of Kedima, who comes first, Ben Habas or Ben Chavero, why not ask the fundamental question? And that is there a chiyuv Talmud Torah through ViLemadetem to Ben Habas? And I suspect that from the omission of the Kesef Mishnah, we learn a great deal. And that is that Ben Habas is not included in the pasuk, Vodatem levanecha ulevnei vanecha. It says bnei vanecha. It doesn't say bnei bitcha. And it certainly doesn't say zarecha. Could it be, and this is really just a mathematical conclusion, but it's scary to think about this, that according to Kesef Mishnah, Vodata, which is the source for the obligation on the grandfather to teach his grandson, does not apply to Ben Bito. And that never even was entertained. There was never a question. It's not on the radar screen. There is no chiyuv on a grandfather to teach his grandson through his daughter's son, Torah. It says b'nei vanecha. That's the end of the story. not b'nei bitcha, but b'nei banecha. But yet, the Kesef Mishnah, despite it all, wants to say that ben bitcha comes under kedima and comes before in the priority to ben chavero. How could it be? If there's no chiyuv on the grandfather to teach his grandson Torah because this is a grandson through his daughter, and in such a case, applying the logic of the Kesef Mishnah, etc., then if there's no chiyuv to teach your grandson, then why is there a din kedima? If there's no chiyuv Talmud Torah vis-a-vis your grandson, meaning through his daughter, then your grandson is like any other ben chavero, and therefore there would be no issue of kedima. Why should there be kedima? And at this point, we want to raise a question that really touches on our whole discussion about the relationship between these two psukim. And we had ViLemadetem and ViLemadetem on the one side, and then we had ViShinantem on the other side. Could it be that someone who is not included under Bnechem or Bnei Bnechem, and therefore there's no chiyuv Talmud Torah to teach them as a father or as a grandfather, but nevertheless, that person would come under ViShinantem levanecha. And when I say levanecha, I mean in Pashtei Dekra, the simple understanding of the pasuk, which means a biological relationship, a relative. Could somebody who's not included in ViLemadetem / ViLemadetem in the chiyuv to teach Torah, could such an individual be described as someone who fits under the category of ViShinantem levanecha? And it seems almost ridiculous, almost inconsistent to suggest such a thing. If there's no chiyuv Talmud Torah in the biological relative, the relatives, one relative to the other, a father to his grandson, and the Kesef Mishnah never even raised the issue of does a grandfather have to teach his daughter's son, his grandson through his daughter, that was never an issue. But yet, the Kesef Mishnah turns around and sets up a din kedima in the case of ben bitcha. How could that be? If there's no chiyuv Talmud Torah, why should there be kedima? He should be no different than anyone else out there in the market who needs a rebbe to teach him Torah. Why kedima? So it seems to me, and I want you to think about this and tell me if you agree, that the Kesef Mishnah is operating with a fascinating possibility that someone who's not included in ViLemadetem osam es bnechem, and he's not included in ViLemadetem levanecha bnei banecha, would nevertheless be included under ViShinantem levanecha to generate a din kedima. And that was the answer that we had yesterday to the Rambam in Kain Lomen Itztave, etc. Meaning, why do we need a chiyuv to teach a son or a grandson when it's included in ViShinantem? Or perhaps it was a davar pashut, it was simple according to Rambam that we need the chiyuv, but why is there a chiyuv included under ViShinantem? And the Rambam's answer is going to be that ViShinantem expands what we have from ViLemadetem, because by putting another hat on the head of the father, in addition to his hat of an Av, we're also giving him a hat of a Chacham. By doing so, we generated din of Kedima. Why? Because now we have two hats that are worn, midin ViShinantem. But I'm asking now, today, for the Kesef Mishnah, a more radical question. Could it be, is it possible in the conceptual world to postulate that although there's no chiyuv under ViLemadetem ViLemadetem, nevertheless there's a chiyuv under ViShinantem? And how does that express itself l'maisa in terms of kedima? So that even if there's no original chiyuv, nevertheless, b'Torah's ben chavero, there's such a thing as a ben chavero who gets precedence. Meaning, let me say it a little better. Sorry, meaning that according to Kesef Mishnah, Ben Bito comes under ViShinantem Levanecha, and again, we're going to invoke the statement of the Kesef Mishnah that Vanecha could mean Zarecha, even though there's no chiyuv to teach him Torah per se in terms of relationships, but it does come under the mitzvah ViShinantem. And here we come to the conclusion that ViLemadetem and ViShinantem are radically different one from the other. They're two fundamentally different machayvim. You remember the word machayev that we spoke about, to generate the chiyuv. What generates the chiyuv in the case of the son is the need to teach the son Torah because he's a young boy, he can't do it on his own. And the Torah obligated the father in that, and then the grandfather. Not so ViShinantem. ViShinantem is a chiyuv of Mesiras HaTorah, that the Torah should be passed on from one generation to the next. And certainly if it's Ben Chaver, there is a transmission of the Torah that's going to go to the next generation. But if it's Beno, then there's a separate chiyuv. That is really the next generation for the father. And if it's Ben Beno, once again, ViShinantem Levanecha. What about Ben Bito? Could it be that Ben Bito now is upgraded to a special status because of the mitzvah of Mesiras HaTorah L'Doros? Because that grandson is the next generation. And that pumps up a ViShinantem with a kedima to give precedence to Ben Bito, even though you don't have any direct chiyuv to Ben Bito, because as the Kesef Mishnah says, again, reading his language for the third time, chayve aviv, it has to go through his father, where here it goes through his mother and not through his father, and therefore there's no chiyuv. But nevertheless, in the mitzvah ViShinantem, which means to set up Talmidim, that they will transmit the Torah to the next generation, there Ben Bito takes on a special status. And the nafkamina is that if you're a chacham and you have a choice between teaching Torah to your grandson through your daughter, Ben Bito, or teaching Ben Chavero, you will give first priorities to the obligation to teach Ben Bito, B'Toras ViShinantem. Okay, then this is where we'll stop. A lot of food for thought over here, and I hope you'll get a chance to learn this and review. Thank you so much.